What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple morning chat, only to face a barrage of personal attacks and dismissive comments from a host who clearly believes she owns the room? In just 36 seconds of brutal questioning, Lorraine Kelly would reveal her true colors and trigger an explosive confrontation that would leave viewers stunned and questioning everything they thought they knew about daytime television. The morning started like any other on The Lorraine Show. The familiar bright yellow sofa sat center stage. The studio lights gleamed warmly, and the audience settled in for what they expected would be another pleasant celebrity interview. Daniel Craig, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that somehow made his piercing blue eyes even more striking, walked onto the set with the quiet confidence that had made him a global icon. The audience erupted in genuine applause, clearly thrilled to see James Bond himself in person. Lorraine Kelly, perched on her usual spot, with that trademark smile plastered across her face, gestured for Daniel to take his seat. But something felt different today. There was an edge to her demeanor, a certain smugness in the way she shuffled her notes and glanced at the cameras. Perhaps it was the pressure of ratings, or maybe she had simply grown too comfortable in her position of power. But whatever the reason, Lorraine was about to show a side of herself that would shock everyone watching. "Daniel Craig, everyone!" she announced with theatrical enthusiasm, her voice carrying that syrupy, sweet tone that immediately felt forced. The man who gave us 7 incredible James Bond films and is now moving on to, well, let's see what's next, shall we? Daniel settled into his seat, offering a genuine smile to the audience before turning his attention to Lorraine. "Thanks for having me, Lorraine. It's great to be here." But instead of the warm welcome viewers expected, Lorraine's expression shifted almost immediately. Her smile became more of a smirk as she leaned forward, clutching her cue cards like weapons. "So Daniel," she began, her voice taking on a condescending tone that would have made anyone uncomfortable. 15 years playing Bond, and now you're done. Some might say you're running away from the role that made you famous. What do you say to people who think you're being ungrateful?" The question hung in the air like a slap. Daniel's eyebrows raised slightly, clearly taken aback by the hostile opening. This wasn't the gentle morning television banner he had prepared for. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden tension that had filled the studio. "I'm sorry, ungrateful," Daniel responded, his voice measured but with a hint of steel beneath the surface. "I gave 15 years of my life to that character. I think I've earned the right to move on to new challenges." Lorraine barely let him finish before jumping back in, her voice growing sharper. "But let's be honest, Daniel, without Bond, where would you be? A few small films here and there? The role made you wealthy beyond imagination, and now you're just walking away. It seems rather selfish, doesn't it?" The studio fell silent. Even the crew members behind the cameras exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction their host was taking. This was supposed to be a promotional interview, not an interrogation. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his professionalism held firm. "Lorraine, I think you might be misunderstanding the situation," he said, his voice calm but with an underlying firmness that suggested he wouldn't be pushed around. "I've been incredibly grateful for the opportunity to play Bond. It's been the honor of my lifetime. But actors grow, they evolve, they want to explore different facets of their craft. That's not selfish, that's natural." But Lorraine wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed emboldened by what she perceived as Daniel's defensive response. She leaned back in her chair with a look of superiority that was becoming more pronounced by the minute. "Natural? Or is it that you've gotten too big for your boots?" she shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've made your millions, bought your fancy houses, and now you think you're above the franchise that created you. I mean, let's face it, Daniel, you're not exactly known for your range as an actor, are you?" The insult landed like a physical blow. The audience gasped audibly, clearly shocked by their beloved host's cruelty. Daniel's composure, which had been admirable up to this point, began to crack. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time since sitting down, he looked genuinely angry. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not known for my range? Have you actually watched any of my other work, Lorraine? Or do you just enjoy making sweeping statements about people's careers on live television?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Lorraine, however, appeared to be enjoying herself, feeding off the conflict she had created. She waved dismissively at Daniel's question, as if his 15 years of acclaimed performances meant nothing. "Oh, please, Daniel. Layer Cake, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, a few indie films. Nothing that really showcases serious acting chops. You've been playing essentially the same character for over a decade. Brooding, mysterious, limited emotional range. It's not exactly Shakespearean, is it? The cruelty in her words was breathtaking. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to his craft, who had trained at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, who had performed on stage and screen with distinction for decades, being dismissed as a one-trick pony by someone whose own acting experience consisted of bit parts in soap operas from 20 years ago. Daniel's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening slightly. The professional mask was slipping, and underneath, the audience could see a man who was genuinely hurt and increasingly furious. "Lorraine," he said, his voice steady but filled with controlled rage. "I'm going to give you one chance to apologize for that comment and redirect this interview towards something resembling professionalism. Because right now, you're not just insulting me, you're insulting every actor who has ever worked hard to build a career in this industry." But Lorraine had crossed the line, and she seemed determined to keep going. She actually laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the studio like glass. "Apologize? For what? Telling the truth? Look, Daniel, we both know that without the Bond franchise, you'd probably be doing dinner theater somewhere. The role fell into your lap, you got lucky, and now you want to pretend you're some sort of serious artist. It's almost comical." That was it. The moment when 15 years of professionalism, of dealing with difficult interviews and maintaining his composure under pressure, finally reached its breaking point. Daniel Craig, the man who had brought one of cinema's most iconic characters to life with dignity and power, stood up from his chair. The studio fell into complete silence as Daniel Craig rose from his chair, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the woman who had just spent the last several minutes systematically trying to destroy his reputation on live television. The audience held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in daytime television history. "You know what, Lorraine?" Daniel said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I came here today as a courtesy. I came here to talk about my work, to connect with people who might enjoy what I do, and to show respect for this program and its viewers. But you've turned this into something ugly and personal." Lorraine, still seated, looked up at him with that same smug expression, clearly believing she was in control of the situation. She gestured casually toward his empty chair, as if his standing up was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Oh, sit down, Daniel. You're being dramatic. This is live television, not a therapy session. If you can't handle a few honest questions about your career choices, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The audacity of her response sent a visible shockwave through the studio. Crew members stopped what they were doing, cameras continued rolling, and the audience sat frozen in their seats. Here was a host who had just spent 10 minutes launching personal attacks, now accusing her guest of being overly sensitive for daring to stand up for himself. Daniel's laugh was cold and bitter. "Honest questions? Is that what you call questioning my talent? Dismissing my entire body of work? And suggesting I'm nothing more than a lucky amateur? Lorraine, I've been acting professionally for over 20 years. I've worked with some of the most respected directors in the industry. I've put my body through hell for these roles. Broken bones, torn muscles, given everything I had to give audiences the best performance possible." He paused, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded everyone exactly why he had been chosen to play James Bond in the first place. "And you sit there, in your comfortable chair, making snide comments about dinner theater? When was the last time you stepped in front of a camera as an actor, Lorraine? When was the last time you put yourself on the line creatively?" The attack hit its mark. Lorraine's face flushed red, and for the first time since the interview began, her composure cracked. She had been so focused on tearing down her guest that she hadn't considered he might fight back with facts about her own limited acting experience. "That's not the point," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm a journalist. I ask tough questions. That's my job." "Your job?" Daniel's voice grew louder, matching her energy but with far more controlled power behind it. "Your job is to ask tough questions, yes? But there's a difference between journalism and cruelty. There's a difference between holding someone accountable and trying to humiliate them for your own entertainment." He began to pace slightly, his hands gesturing as he spoke, the passion and intelligence that had made him such a compelling actor now fully on display. "You want to talk about my career? Fine. Let's talk about it properly. I've worked with Sam Mendes, Steven Spielberg, David Fincher. I've done Shakespeare on stage. I've taken risks with independent films that mattered to me artistically, even when they paid a fraction of what Bond offered." The audience was transfixed. This wasn't the polite, measured celebrity interview they were used to seeing. This was raw, real, and completely unscripted. Daniel Craig was defending not just himself, but the dignity of his profession. "But you don't want to hear about any of that," he continued, turning back to face Lorraine directly. You want to create drama. You want to tear someone down so you can feel important, so you can generate headlines and social media buzz. Well, congratulations, Lorraine. You've succeeded. Lorraine, clearly rattled but still trying to maintain her authority, stood up as well, though she was dwarfed by Daniel's presence. You're out of line, Daniel. This is my show, my studio, and you're a guest here. You don't get to lecture me about how to do my job. Your show? Daniel's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. You think that gives you the right to say whatever you want about people? You think that title makes you untouchable? Let me tell you something about being a professional, Lorraine. It means treating people with respect. It means doing your research before you make sweeping statements about someone's career. It means understanding that there's a human being sitting across from you, not just a target for your amusement. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Both of them were standing now, facing off in front of millions of viewers who were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The studio crew didn't know whether to keep filming or intervene, but the cameras kept rolling. Lorraine's mask of superiority was completely gone now, replaced by barely contained fury. How dare you come into my studio and speak to me like this? I've been doing this job for decades. I've interviewed presidents, prime ministers, the biggest names in entertainment. I don't need some aging action star telling me how to conduct an interview. The words aging action star hung in the air like a death sentence. It was the final insult, the last straw, and everyone in the studio knew it. Daniel's face went completely still, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but filled with a controlled rage that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. There it is, he said softly. The real Lorraine Kelly. Not the warm, friendly morning show host that people see on their screens. The person who thinks age is an insult, who believes that success gives her the right to be cruel, who has so little respect for her guests that she'll resort to personal attacks when her professional authority is questioned. He shook his head slowly, a look of genuine disappointment crossing his features. You know what's truly sad, Lorraine? You had an opportunity today. You had one of the most successful actors of his generation sitting in your studio, willing to share his experiences, his insights, his stories. Instead, you chose to use that time to try to make yourself look important by making him look small. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some were clearly uncomfortable with the conflict, while others seemed fascinated by seeing their polished morning show host being called out so directly and powerfully. Lorraine's response was swift and vicious. Get out, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Get out of my studio right now. Security. But Daniel was already moving toward the exit, his dignity intact despite the chaos around him. He turned back one final time, his voice carrying clearly across the studio. I'll leave, Lorraine, but I want everyone watching to remember what they've seen here today. Daniel Craig stood at the edge of the stage area, his words echoing through the stunned studio as Lorraine Kelly frantically gestured for security. But something remarkable happened in that moment. Instead of rushing to escort him out, the security personnel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they were being asked to handle. Even they could see that the real problem wasn't the guest who had defended himself with dignity, but the host who had created this mess in the first place. Remember what exactly? Lorraine shouted, her voice cracking with a mixture of fury and desperation. That you couldn't handle a proper interview? That you threw a tantrum when someone asked you real questions about your career? Daniel turned back slowly, and the look on his face was one of profound sadness rather than anger. It was the expression of someone who had just witnessed something truly disappointing about human nature, and it was more devastating than any angry outburst could have been. They'll remember, he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, that when given the choice between building someone up and tearing them down, you chose cruelty. They'll remember that when you had the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation about art, about craft, about the things that matter in this industry, you decided instead to make it about your own ego. The audience was completely captivated. Many were leaning forward in their seats, some with their hands over their mouths in shock. This wasn't just a celebrity meltdown or a host losing control. This was a masterclass in how to maintain dignity under attack, and everyone watching seemed to understand they were witnessing something special. Lorraine, however, was beyond reason now. Her carefully constructed television persona had completely crumbled, revealing someone who couldn't handle being challenged or criticized. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? She screamed, walking around like you own the world because you played a character in a few movies. A few movies? Daniel's eyebrows raised, And for the first time since the confrontation began, there was a hint of genuine amusement in his voice. "Lorraine, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're so committed to diminishing what I've done that you can't even acknowledge basic facts." The Bond films alone grossed over $7 billion worldwide. They employed thousands of people, brought joy to millions of fans, and helped establish Britain as a major player in global cinema. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "But more importantly, every single person who worked on those films, from the stunt coordinators to the catering staff, deserves more respect than you've shown today. Because we all showed up, did our jobs professionally, and treated each other with basic human decency." The contrast was stark and undeniable. Here was Daniel Craig, under intense attack, still finding ways to acknowledge and praise the work of others, while Lorraine Kelly seemed incapable of recognizing any achievement that wasn't her own. "Oh, please," Lorraine spat, but her voice had lost much of its earlier venom. "Spare me the noble speech about teamwork. You're just mad because someone finally called you out for being overrated." Daniel shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a kind of weary wisdom. "You know what the really tragic part of this is, Lorraine? I actually used to respect your work. I've watched this show before. I've seen you interview people with warmth and intelligence. I know you're capable of better than this." The words hit harder than any insult could have. By acknowledging her capabilities, Daniel was making her current behavior even more inexcusable. He wasn't dismissing her as talentless or incompetent. He was holding her accountable for choosing to be cruel when she could have chosen to be kind. "But something has changed," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Maybe it's the pressure of ratings. Maybe it's the influence of social media. Maybe it's just the corrosive effect of being in a position of power for too long without anyone challenging you. Whatever it is, it's turned you into someone who thinks that tearing others down is the same thing as building yourself up." Lorraine's face had gone through several color changes during this speech, from red with anger to pale with what might have been shame, though she was fighting hard not to show it. "You don't know anything about the pressures I face," she said, but the fight was going out of her voice. "You're right," Daniel agreed, surprising everyone. "I don't know the specific pressures you face as a television host, just like you clearly don't know the pressures I face as an actor. The difference is, I came here today willing to learn about your world, to engage with you as a professional. You came into this interview with your mind already made up about who I was and what I represented." He began walking slowly back toward the center of the stage, not to return to his seat, but to make sure his final words reached everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home. "I've spent my entire adult life in front of cameras, Lorraine. I've been criticized by some of the toughest critics in the world. I've had my performances analyzed, dissected, praised, and torn apart by people far more knowledgeable about acting than either of us. And you know what I've learned from all of that? The criticism that matters, the criticism that helps you grow, comes from a place of wanting to see you succeed. It comes from people who understand what you're trying to do and want to help you do it better." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Even Lorraine had stopped trying to interrupt, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. "What you did today wasn't criticism," Daniel continued. "It was cruelty disguised as journalism. It was an attempt to diminish someone else in order to make yourself feel more important. And the saddest part is that you didn't need to do it. You're successful. You have a platform that millions of people watch. You could have used that platform to have a real conversation about art, about storytelling, about what it means to dedicate your life to entertaining others." He paused at the edge of the stage area, his hand resting on the back of a chair. "Instead, you chose to use it as a weapon, and that says nothing about me, Lorraine, but it says everything about you." With those words, Daniel Craig walked calmly toward the studio exit, his head held high, leaving behind him a host who had been thoroughly exposed, an audience that had witnessed something unprecedented, and a piece of television that would be talked about and analyzed for years to come. As the studio doors closed behind him, the cameras continued to roll, capturing Lorraine Kelly standing alone on her stage, the bright studio lights suddenly seeming harsh and unforgiving, the silence stretching on as she struggled to find words that could somehow repair what she had just destroyed.